Good evening all, and welcome. Truckers have a hard time on the road. It can be difficult driving such heavy freights for long distances and long amounts of time. They can have creepy encounters happen to them, or be the creeps themselves, the likes of which we're about to find out. So get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. This was a story I grew up hearing my mum tell me. I was really young when this happened, and I know for a fact it was before I was 5. I only have some foggy memory of the event, especially because my mum at the time didn't want to freak me out. Some context. We have family all over the country. I remember spending so much of my childhood just on road trips from state to state to visit family. So we know our ins and outs on traveling. When I was a child, I would randomly hug strangers and tell them I loved them. I was so filled with joy and love that it just spilled out into other people. There was basically only one stranger I never immediately latched onto, the second I saw them. This is that story. My mum was taking me to visit some relatives while my dad was staying at home with my brothers. She had to go to house sit, and in general is a better caretaker of me than my father. So it made sense that I went with her. We were driving for hours until we finally hit a rest stop and got out to use the restroom. Now, there was already this guy in the parking lot who, according to my mum, it looked like he was watching everyone who was entering and leaving the rest stop. The second we got out of the car, he did too. My mum held my hand, and we head into the restroom, but immediately picked up on the fact I let go of her hand to hold her other hand, the side of her away from the man. Now looking back, she told me it was clear somewhere in my tiny child brain I picked up on some sign of danger. I avoided the man as much as I could, and would quicken my pace to the restroom and car. I never did that with another stranger ever again, and I had never blatantly avoided another adult like that. We do our business and head back to the car, and the man had gone back to his car and watched us leave, only to then follow us to his own car. My mum immediately recognized what was going on and tried to shake him off on the highway. He wouldn't budge and tried to get as close as he could. Apparently while doing this, a semi-truck driver noticed how frantic and off she was driving and could see her looking back at his car. He realized what was going on and drove up to the side and kind of made eye contact with her, and they were on the same page from then on out. Turns out the driver called up on his radio to other truckers and told them what was going on, and a bunch of drivers from different routes nearby came onto the same highway we were traveling on. A few minutes later, they began blocking out the guy's car and essentially trapping him away from my mother, and as she turned onto an exit to get off the highway to another rest stop, as the original trucker driving us followed in. He got out and spoke with my mother and told her he picked up what was going on, asked if we were okay, and drove with us to a Burger King and got us something to eat. We spoke and he followed us back onto the road, until eventually we went our separate ways. So to the guy who was probably trying to take my mum and I, let's not meet. And a huge thanks to the truck driver who quite possibly saved our lives. This happened around 2 years ago. I was 16 and my family was on their way to Mexico. The main point of going was for my grandfather to meet my little brother, who was around 7 at the time. For those of you who don't know, the roads in Mexico, once you cross the border at Laredo, you either take the freeway or the toll road. The freeway is a fast pass to getting thrown off the road and off a mountain, quite literally. The road isn't wide and big trucks hardly fit in their own lane, as if they respect the yellow line in the middle. Toll roads are supposed to be the safer alternative. You pay a certain fee depending on your vehicle at different spots, and there's supposed to be federal policemen along the highway. About 4 hours before we got to my dad's hometown, we approached a bridge with a lot of traffic, which was odd since the rest of the road hadn't been so clustered. Being from the US, we found it odd that some vehicles were driving over the white line on the right side of each lane, in the shoulder. My dad, the driver, assumed it was to give access to passing. Keep in mind we had never driven to Mexico alone, and it had been over 8 years since we were last there. So there was an 18-wheeler, or perhaps 26-wheeler, in front of us. It was like those FedEx trucks that pulled 2 short trailers at once, but this one was pulling 3 normal-sized ones. It was moving so slow, being the cause of traffic in the right lane. Since he was driving on the shoulder, my dad decided to pass him, still able to do so without crossing the yellow line into oncoming traffic. We noticed that the other cars weren't doing the same, but we didn't think much of it. After a while, I looked back out the window, trying to take a picture of the sunset. This is when I saw the same truck coming at us at full speed. I froze in fear as I saw this gigantic thing of a truck coming at us. My brothers noticed that I was staring out the window and looking back. My younger brother, at 13, yelled to my dad that he needed to move. As if things could get worse, there was traffic on the oncoming lane, so there was no way of us passing the vehicle in front of us. My mum began to panic. Her then undiagnosed anxiety was getting to her, and she was constantly turning in her seat, yelling to my dad that the truck didn't seem to be slowing down. My dad managed to calm her, and we refused to look back and build into the anxiety. 3 minutes later, my 7-year-old brother looked back and said the truck was tailgating us. It was flashing its brights at us, and the driver's arm was out the window, shooting us the middle finger and motioning for us to pull over. As if a miracle, traffic was clearing out of an exit, and my dad managed to leave the truck behind. But 30 to 40 minutes later, this same truck came flying past us as we were going uphill. He blared his horn and pulled into the correct lane again as a tiny white car came over the steep hill. To this day, I get chills thinking about what could have happened if my dad pulled over. I work in a store, and I had a store full of people the other day, and I do pretty well making small talk with people, as I work in the adult novelty department, and you have to make it as normal as possible so people feel okay enough to open up with you and let you know what they need or are wanting. Education is part of my job sometimes, talking to older people is too, and I love to be able to make someone smile or just get more information on a product that they might not know about or even thought about. This guy was a typical trucker, coming in for his select DVDs, not saying much. Dead giveaway for me to tell he was a trucker. They all wear the headsets and say things like, "Man, I just came back from this place. How do they have a girl like you working here?" Always the same stuff, different person. I've grown accustomed to small talk and such with people. He was wandering the DVDs, and when my line was dying down, he came up to my platform to pay, and of course was talking to me about what his plans were. Apparently he was meeting this woman in the Dallas area when he was going to be there the next day, and she had a kid, so he was a little skeptical to online dating. He tells me that he is old-fashioned and wants her to feel comfortable meeting up and such, and he go to her. As he's talking to me, I finally get his DVDs rung up and bagged and thought it would be it. The "you have a good day" and such rant I tell everyone, but no. This dude decided to stand at my counter on the platform and talk to me while I was working on my line of guys in the store wanting to get home. The guy freaked me out just a little at first, because he would seem to follow me if I was trying to do something on the platform, like get something out of the case for a customer, or immediately start talking to me when he saw I wasn't busy. Eventually, the creep alarm in my head goes off, and I text my husband, who was home, and tell him it's an emergency. I'm getting creeped out, and he tells me he's coming, and the guy is still in my store following me whatever I do. I move to do something, and I'm counting the minutes in my head until my husband comes in. He eventually got the hint I was trying to make him leave by my one-word answers and not moving from my spot on the platform, and he said he was leaving. It turns out he parked next to my car. Mind you, we have just a small regular parking lot, but it goes from the front of the store to the side of the building, so he can park anywhere. We have cameras in the back, so I can see him move his car to the side of the building in view of my cars, because I went outside and saw him leave and act like I was going to smoke, and walked back in when I saw him get into his vehicle. Finally, my husband comes in. It's an hour before I'm supposed to get off work, so I ask him to stay around just in case, and I tell him everything that's just happened, and he's not even fazed by it. I get off work and tell my coworker what happened, and he's more scared than I am. He's a small-build Asian guy who looks like he couldn't scare a fly, and I thought he was going to pee himself. I get the husband to follow me outside and get into my car and lock it immediately. I don't even wait for my coworker to come outside before gunning and leaving. I drove a different way home than before and checked every few minutes to make sure I wasn't followed. Thankfully, neither of us have seen this guy since, but now I always get scared of coming off too nice to anyone, in fear of something happening that I do not intend. This happened back in March. My sister and I were heading to an airport for our 6 a.m. flight to Orlando, Florida, to visit Universal Studios. This incident happened between 3 and 3:30 a.m. We were driving along the interstate when we came up behind a semi-truck. The semi-truck is keeping up with traffic, so my sister decides not to pass him, knowing that I really hate being next to big trucks because I'm scared of them. My family has had a few close calls with them, and I've personally known people who've lost loved ones in horrific accidents involving trucks. For a while, being behind the truck was fine. Like I said, it was keeping up with the flow of traffic and being fine. But then, about 20 minutes in, the driver starts doing a few bizarre things. The truck will start to brake, or it starts to swerve into the next lane. There is literally nothing in front of the truck, nor is it stormy. It was a cloudy night, but not windy. We weren't following the truck very close, but after that, my sister backs off even more. Soon enough, we're away from the rest of traffic, and it's just us and the truck. It's still randomly hitting the brakes, when it suddenly swerves off the lane and hits the rumble stripes. I'm finally like, will you just pass this truck? He's being really weird. My sister agrees with me and starts gaining speed to just go around the truck quickly, and as she signals and switches lanes, the truck speeds up a little. My sister doesn't let that deter her and just hits the gas. When we get up next to the cab of the truck, the driver lays on his horn, starts flashing his high beams, and speeds up even more and starts to swerve over into our lane. My sister floors it and manages to pull her car in front, though we were forced onto the rumble stripes to avoid being sideswiped by this truck. She keeps going fast, and when we're a good distance in front of it, she gets back over and starts to slow down. But then she's like, seriously, what is this truck's problem? I look in the side mirror, and the truck is just hauling ass, trying to catch us up. My sister speeds up again and is pushing past 85 miles an hour, when we're able to start pulling away from the truck, as the speed limit signs are 65 for trucks and 70 for cars. We eventually catch up to the traffic that had left us behind with the truck, and from there we are able to slow down a little more. But with the truck gaining speed on us, we passed through them, and when the truck caught up with traffic, he slowed way down and we were able to lose him. I've told this story to people before, and they're always like, oh, sounds like road rage. But I honestly don't know what my sister and I did to annoy this guy in that case. But I do know that this trucker made my paranoia around semi-trucks even worse. I am a company-employed commercial truck driver. I drive in a fleet that primarily transports loads between Detroit, Michigan, and various locations in the Greater Toronto area in Ontario. To get to Toronto, I cross the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor and drive on Highway 401. The 401 is the primary highway for most travellers to take who are going from Windsor to Toronto and vice versa. It also does continue east all the way to Quebec provincial line. My drive consists of taking a load from Detroit to Toronto and picking up another load in Toronto and taking it back to Detroit. I do this for the week and take the weekend off. Being that I take 401 so much, I'm able to predict where traffic patterns get bad during what times, which helps dictate when and where I will be shutting down for the night. This particular time, I recall, happened recently in 2018 to 2019 winter. Most people living in the Midwest know this winter. It started very mild in the first half between October and a bit of December. But once January hit, Old Man Winter made up for a lost time and brought Arctic weather down south to most of the Midwestern US and Canada. It was colloquially termed the polar vortex. It lasted about a week and a half between January and February, if I remember right, and it brought nasty blizzards and sub-freezing temperatures in the negative teens and 20s. That's just in Fahrenheit. So imagine the poor individuals reading it in Celsius. It's safe to say the last half of that winter sucked. I was driving a load westbound on the 401 back to Detroit when I came across 3 different occasions of whiteouts between Woodstock and Chatham. For those of you who don't know, whiteouts are a winter phenomenon that occur when harsh winds and heavy snowfall combine to make a horrible driving condition. The winds billow the snow and make visibility abysmal. No amount of light can pierce through these awful weather patterns. They can come down suddenly with little to no warning. A vehicle could be about 10 feet in front of you just before a whiteout hits, and the next moment it could be gone once the whiteout strikes. When these 3 different whiteouts hit, it went from a nice afternoon sun to barely being able to see past my hood. Most of us truckers and car drivers would slow down and turn on our hazards to accommodate for this sudden change in weather and visibility. Once it cleared, which happened quite quickly, we would speed up again to normal highway speed. One thing I noticed when the whiteout hit was that most drivers didn't try to spread out much. We would cluster together so we could see each other. At first, this seemed like a good idea, but when I remembered a few YouTube videos of what happens when drivers cluster together in times of poor driving condition, car accident pile-ups tend to happen, and most of us were trucks with a few cars mixed in. I realized this and backed away from a few of the trucks and said a short prayer to the Lord for safety. Once out of the last of the storm, I thanked God for our safety and hoped others would make it safely through. I dropped my load in Detroit and swapped it for a Canada-bound trailer and headed back east on the 401 as I still had plenty of time left to drive. However, once I approached London, Ontario, I noticed that the westbound side of the highway was surprisingly void of traffic. I have driven this particular stretch of highway often enough to know this is a bad sign. When 401 is empty, that is usually an indication that there has been a massive accident that has stopped all traffic heading in that direction. Being that 401 is a corridor-type highway between Windsor and Toronto, there aren't any other major alternative roads to take in case of an emergency. Highway traffic must be diverted onto the paved farm-style 2-lane roads that run near the highway. Logistically, this is a traffic nightmare and severely delays any travel and causes backups for miles. Driving through London, my CB radio lit up with various chatter regarding a big accident that has occurred. Sure enough, I came across one of the worst pile-ups I had ever seen. 20 to 30 trucks and cars were piled up, forming about a football field's length of wrecked vehicles. By this time it was dark, so I couldn't see too many details. But what I could see were the wrecks were covered in a layer of snow, which meant they had to have been there at least an hour or so. I tried to see if there were any people moving about the vehicles, but there were none. Being that the accident happened a little while ago, I don't think anyone lingered too long in their wrecked vehicles. As I drove past the back of the scene, I noticed paramedics and police officers and recovery crewmen working on getting the rearmost vehicles cleared away in artificial light provided by mobile light carts. Seeing the paramedics, I wondered how extensive their injuries were, or if there were any fatalities. I remembered one car in the wreck that was particularly mangled past recognition, and thought that anyone who would be in that car would have most likely perished. A short while after, I found a place to park. More appropriately, I had to MacGyver a parking spot, as the lot was already past capacity due to the accident. After parking, I went into the restaurant attached to the truck stop and began to mull over what I had seen. 3 major things came to mind among other thoughts. Firstly, I couldn't help but think that I unwittingly looked into the darkened windows of the smashed vehicles, possibly still holding its occupants that most likely met a violent end. I know that this is highly unlikely, but you know how most human minds tend to wander to dark places. Secondly, after passing through the last storm, I couldn't help but think that those whiteouts were going to cause serious accidents if they kept up. And third, I remember the snow that was accumulating atop the disabled vehicles, and thought that the accident couldn't have occurred not more than 30 minutes of me passing that very spot a few hours ago. I thought how close I had possibly been to being involved in that disaster. If I recall correctly, there was at least one fatality from that massive wreck, and that was one of the 3 major weather-related accidents that occurred on the 401 that winter. Winter will be upon us soon enough, and that will bring a whole slew of bad winter weather if last winter is anything to go by. So for anyone looking to travel and come across any inclement winter weather, drive to the conditions and don't be too proud to get off the road and find a safe place to park while waiting out the storm. It very well could just save your life. Being a young woman in a nearly exclusively male-dominated industry, I have plenty of stories about creepers I've encountered over the years. This particular story, about this one particular creeper, is likely the worst yet. At the time, I was working for a steel pipe processing plant as a receiver. Trucks with 40-foot-long pipes would come in, and it was my job to offload them with a giant forklift. First, though, I had to collect the BOL from the truck driver. BOL stands for Bill of Landing. It's a shipping document that has information about what's on the load, where it's going, and where it's from. I would receive the BOL from the trucker and would compare the sheet to the cargo and sign it off, if everything checks out. I would see a lot of the same drivers on a regular basis. I got a lot of joking comments about how I looked too young to be driving a machine that size. A few of them asked me out, but I'm married, and most of the guys respected that. So when I encountered a new driver from one of the other trucking companies, it really didn't surprise me when one of the first very things he said was, "How old are you?" 23, I replied with a half-hearted chuckle. "Are you married?" "I'm engaged, so pretty much," I reply, starting to get reasonably uneasy about this guy. Not wanting to make small talk or answer any more increasingly personal questions from this guy, I ask him for the BOL. "Anything for you, my sexy girl." "Excuse me, what did you call me?" "It's really sexy to see a girl like you driving a big truck." Now I'm a bit of a hothead. I need to stand up for myself in situations like this, or else I risk becoming a welcome mat for this kind of attention. He hands me his paperwork with the trademark creepy grin, like he was getting off on the fact that I was within grabbing distance from him. "Listen, old man," as I snatched the paper out of his hand. "I did not come to work to be spoken to like that. I'm here for a paycheck, not a date." "What? It was just a compliment. Don't be like that, sexy girl." "Don't call me or say anything to me that you wouldn't say to any of my male co-workers. I have a name. And it's not smart to talk to anyone like that before you know what it is. I bet it is. I signed off on his sheet, dropped his copy in the mud, and went over to the other driver waiting in line, took his paperwork, and made Creeper wait about half-hour offloading 2 other trucks before I got to his. We have a safety rule that is, the driver must be inside the truck while it's being offloaded. So I took this opportunity to be even more nasty and laid on the horn of my truck and angrily yelled at him to get into his truck. After I offloaded him, I went to my supervisor and told him what happened. Not a formal complaint, but to make him aware of everything that transpired, and to let him know that the driver might end up complaining to his supervisor about how long it took for me to see him. My supervisor sided with me. He knows that if I lost my mind on someone, they deserved it. He knew about a few other incidents prior, so he was supportive, and he told me to report anything else the guy does that's messed up, and said he'd be willing to send someone else over to deal with that particular driver, if and when he bought another load. Later on in the day, he made a funny comment about how sexy I looked in my uniform. Oversized overalls, grease-stained high-vis, boots, and a hard hat. I didn't wear makeup or perfume. I looked like, and was mistaken for, one of the guys on a few other occasions. So the creeper must have been thinking, oh my god, a girl must say nasty stuff. I thought I made things pretty clear to the creeper, and that he wasn't going to bother me anymore. Nevertheless, I wasn't keen on the idea of having to walk up to his cab to get paperwork from him again. The next day, guess who shows up with a new load? I call over the radio. My favorite driver is here, can someone come and grab his paperwork? A few minutes go by and one of the co-workers I get along with drives up in his smaller tow motor and approaches the driver for his BOL. I wait off the side and take the opportunity to have a smoke next to my machine while I wait for my co-worker to come back with the paperwork. He comes back, and of course he wants the scoop on everything that happened yesterday. I guess the driver asked why I wasn't there to collect the BOL, and the co-worker told him I was busy. Meanwhile, I was having a smoke in clear view, in no hurry to offload him, and I told my co-worker what transpired, when suddenly my co-worker interrupted me. Oh, don't look now, but I think he's taking pictures of you. Of course, my head whipped around, and sure enough, Buddy was holding up his phone, pointing it at me. Taking pictures, I assume. I scurried up into my machine and got on the radio for my supervisor. Favorite driver is taking pictures of me. 10 to 4, I'll call security, do not offload him. Given the nature of what we do and why we do it, there are strict security guidelines at this place. Once a month, we had a bomb sniffer dog inspect the property. It was that big of a deal. So even if he wasn't taking pictures of me, he had no business taking pictures on the property. Security show up, and I watch as the driver hands him his phone. My coworker was there with him, and later told me the guy said he was just trying out his new phone. Bullcrap, but whatever. They didn't find photos of me or the property on his phone, but he had a few minutes to delete them. Either way, he was barred from the property, and my supervisor reported him, and what had happened the day before to the driver's employee. I never saw him again, but the story doesn't end there. A few weeks later, another driver from the same company, nice guy that I had a good rapport with, filled me in on my favorite driver. Your buddy got canned, yeah? Oh, that's too bad, I'm gonna miss him. Yeah, he was always on thin ice because the girls in the office were getting weird vibes from him. Always hanging around the office way more than necessary, but nothing to fire him over though. But his police report came in, and it turns out he had several misdeeds in his past against women. Oh, lovely. So, wherever you are, creepy predator truck driver, let's not meet. I'm a hazmat tanker truck driver for an on-site diesel fueling company in Massachusetts, and have a creepy encounter. I work typically from 3 p.m. to 2 a.m. and was fueling up school buses in Sudbury, Massachusetts at 11:30 p.m. It was 5 Fahrenheit, and I was alone one night after a heavy snowstorm. This stop takes roughly 1 hour to complete, and there was nothing but swamp and old Revolutionary War cemeteries 15 feet away. I was fueling my final school bus and had to navigate through thorns and a snowbank to fuel this final one. Not a minute later, into my last bus, I hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps trudging through the snow. Whoever this was sounded strong and large. I was worried and afraid that someone was going to pull a weapon on me and mug me, as some routes have desperate homeless folk. "Who's there?" I shouted. "I'm armed." I don't carry anything with me, but was afraid and thought that if I was about to be attacked by someone, it's best to lie, so perhaps they wouldn't. Then I heard the footsteps grow louder and closer and stop within 1 foot of me, thinking this person was coming to hurt me. I was terrified. I wear a very bright LED headlight at night so that I can see. I turn on my lights as bright as they can go and take some steps back, ready to defend myself. I often think ghosts can be explained by loose pipes, and Bigfoot is often a bear, but this was unexplainable. After turning on the headlight as bright as can be, I see no one. My scanner goes from fully charged to dead, and my headlights dim considerably. Remember, this is 15 feet or less from a 300-year-old cemetery in Sudbury, and is a very wealthy town with no homeless folk and no crime, and mostly woods. Especially where I was, which is what makes footsteps all the more creepy. I know this is not particularly eventful, but I'm convinced this was a paranormal experience and needed to share it. As a trucker who works at night, I can truly say that was the weirdest thing that had ever happened to me. I'm a truck driver and still am in employment. A number of years back, I was driving along a highway. I don't want to mention where, and it was quite late out. I want to make it very clear I still had plenty of time left and was in no way tired as I was doing this night run. I also preferred driving at night, as that means there tends to be considerably less traffic on the road, which makes my runs far easier, not to mention my job more enjoyable, as I just listen to music as I plow along. I was paying very close attention to the road. It was a bit wet from rainfall earlier that day, but it was dark and the moon was out, so aside from puddles and slipping, I would mostly be fine. That's when I see something in the distance. It appeared like a woman, walking bare feet in the middle of the road. I thought I was about to hit her. I was coming up dangerously close. I looked in my mirrors and knew that there was nothing I could do. It was already too late. I don't know how I didn't see her before. She seemed to just pop out of nowhere. And, although I didn't feel anything, the horrible guilt hit my gut, and I quickly pulled over as rapidly as I could, convinced I had just ended someone's life. I pull over, shaking like a leaf, and slowly get out of the cab and make my way in the dark towards where the figure was. I have my flashlight, preparing for the worst, ready to see what carnage I had just bestowed to the road and the innocent life that I had stolen from this earth. I walk. No other vehicles are coming, and I don't see anything. I keep walking, and at this point I've gone further than I knew I'd travelled. There was nothing and no one on the road. Did they avoid my truck? But how? I looked to the sides of the road, and it was a bank. I shined my flashlight down to have a peek, but no one was there. I yelled into the dark, "Hello? Is there anyone there? Are you okay?" There was no response. I listened, straining my ears, and at that moment a truck flew by. I listened attentively, just as I could hear the truck humming away in the distance, but there was nothing. Profoundly creeped out, I made my way back to the truck. I got into my cab, sat for a minute to gather my thoughts, and just breathed. I was on the verge of hyperventilating, and needed to know what had just occurred. At that moment, I start up the engine, and start making my way slowly back onto the road, trying to ignore it and pretend it didn't happen. Well, a few months later, I'm at a cafe with a few fellow truckers just having a conversation. The road in question was one I didn't have to go down all too often, and then out of the blue one of them says, "Had some creepy stuff happen to me the other night," and goes into detail about how he saw a woman, swerved, nearly totaled his truck doing so, but managed to regain composure just in time to carry on and stop. He went out to check, and there was no one there. My heart fell like a stone, and I plucked up the courage to share my own story. When the group had heard both encounters, one of them said, "I'd heard stories of that road. Apparently there's a ghost of a woman who was killed on that very road, and she sometimes appears and scares motorists. Be careful out there, guys." I don't know if this is true or not, or if he was just making a story up, but it's creepy to know that both of us experienced the same thing, not too far apart, on the same road. It has opened my eyes that there could be something else after this world. As to what, I do not know, but I certainly have no intention of finding out anytime soon, and I really hope that our afterlife isn't being confined to a road. I hope that poor girl manages to move on. When I was 18, I started working second shift for a logistics company, doing dispatch inside the office. One night around 9 p.m, I get a call from a driver in a panic. Now we've hauled vans, glass, flatbeds, and even hazmats, so sometimes we have big problems to fix. I had only been there for a few weeks, and hadn't had to deal with any chemical spills or anything crazy, so I calmly tried to ask him what's going on and what he needs help with, but I'm already freaking out. He tells me he's got lot lizards all over his truck, and that they're trying to get in and he doesn't know what to do. I'm confused as hell, so ask a co-worker to handle this. Do I call the cops or an exterminator? The other 3 people working second shift just start laughing and won't say anything to me, but tell me I better get back on the phone. I pick up the phone and the trucker is laughing his ass off. This is when I start to calm down a little, and a bit of logic came back, and I figure out what lot lizards were. The guy called in at least once a week for a year to try and mess with me. Best driver we ever had. I've been driving trucks for over 14 years now, and I must say I still love it to this day. One of the things that keep me hooked to it are the experiences I have while out on the road. There's always something new to see on each trip I take, even if I've been through the same state, driven past the same mountains and natural wonders, or been down the same road hundreds of times before. Something about it always changes, and I notice something new about the landscapes each time I pass through them. There have definitely been some good times and good memories along the way, but there have also been some bad ones too. One bad experience in particular seems to come to mind first every time. Whenever someone asks me, "What's the worst thing you've ever seen during your time on the road?" I always tell them about the fat man and his skinny cow. It happened like this. Our paths crossed about 5 years ago on a dark but cloudless night in Tohatchi, New Mexico, along Highway 491, better known as the Devil's Highway, on my way to Salt Lake City. It was around 1 in the morning and I was literally the only vehicle on the road for miles. I have already been driving for about 9 hours at this point, so I know I was fighting the urge to fall asleep. But what I saw on the side of the road woke me up real fast and sent chills down my spine. At first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but after a quick double take I realized that they weren't. It was a fat man who appeared to be out for an early morning walk with his emaciated cow. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Now this is New Mexico after all. Though they are sparse, people and cows are not uncommon in this state. But then again, I'm also in the middle of nowhere. The only speck of human existence for miles around is this small CDP of Daiichi. It's one of those blink and you'll miss it towns. Add to that, as I previously mentioned, it's 1 a.m. No one should be out walking their nearly dead cow on this side of a highway at this time of night, or at all for that matter. At this point, my curiosity takes over. I want to know what this fat man is up to. Now, I've heard all kinds of horrible stories about this road, ranging from ghosts attacking people in their cars to UFO abductions and everything in between. But at this point in my life, I wasn't a believer in all that hype. So I pull over, popped my brakes and stepped down out of the relative safety of my W900, like I was about to pump fuel at a truck stop. It just wasn't a big deal to me. That was a big mistake, however, as I quickly found out, since almost immediately upon touching the ground with my size 13 boot, the otherwise warm air suddenly became cool. I thought this was odd, and it was definitely unsettling, but I dismissed it as being a desert thing, and began walking towards the back of my trailer, where I would meet up with the fat man to see if he needed any help. About halfway back, I started hearing a faint whisper, aside from me and the fat man. There was no one else out there, and it didn't sound like it was coming from his direction. I don't mind admitting that it weirded me out a little. I was actually starting to regret ever stopping the truck, and was especially starting to regret getting out of it. But I decided I would brave it out, because after all, if I was sensing this, he had to be also. As I approached the end of my trailer, the air around me started to become unbearably cold, to the point where I could see my own breath, and goosebumps started forming all over my arm. Now I'm completely freaked out by all of this. But being the brave soul that I was back then, I forced myself to stay there and see if the fat man needed anything. As he got closer, the air got even colder, and by now I started to pick up the faint stench of death as well. Me being me, I tried to convince myself it was the cow. It had to be. So I stood at the end of my trailer and waited for him to walk up. As he emerged from the darkness of the night and stepped into the bright beam of the LED taillights, I started to see a face, tinted in a red hue, that sent chills immediately down my spine. His eyes were sewed shut, his nose was bloody, and his jaw looked like it was broken. He walked with a limp and was being guided by his cow, which was tethered by a chain around its neck, the other end wrapped around the man's waist at least 4 or 5 times. This was undoubtedly a gruesome sight to see. The chain meant that wherever the cow went, he went too. Appalled by this, I instantly snapped into action and ran to the truck to grab my phone and call the police, and a pair of bolt cutters to cut the chain off him. By the time I came back, he was already halfway up the length of my trailer on the other side, so I gave chase. When I finally caught up to him, I told him my name and explained what I was going to do. But before I could cut the first piece of chain, he turned around and faced me. It was very dark and I could barely see him, but the little bit of him that was illuminated by my hazard lights was all I needed to see. He took a step towards me and slowly extended his right arm out at the same time. Then he stopped with his finger less than an inch from my nose and said, in a demonic voice, "I choose you." With that, the cow suddenly disappeared, and I started to feel something wrap around my waist. I looked down and see the chain. My eyelids started to itch and sting, and felt like they were being forced shut. In the midst of this happening, the fat man was chanting something, but I couldn't make it out, because I was in so much pain from my jawbone, which felt like it was being broken by some unseen force. Completely helpless, I cried out in agony, but my voice started becoming distorted and soon was replaced by a raspy, phlegmy howl. I was still conscious during this whole thing, and I felt everything just before the transformation was complete. I started seeing images in my head that looked, sounded, and felt like I was being beaten with my hands bound together behind my back by 2 men in what looked to be soldiers' uniforms from the Revolutionary era. They looked very unkempt. Their hair was long and greasy, their beards were raggedy and had droplets of whiskey in them. They were shouting at me in English, but somehow, even though I speak English myself, I couldn't understand what they were saying. Back behind one of the men, I saw the same cow that was walking with the fat man on the side of the road. It was wandering around aimlessly with a chain wrapped around its neck. The men started sewing my eyes shut, and I could hear them laughing at me as they finished one eye and started on the other. Everything was going dark as they put the last stitches in, and then I felt a blow to my nose and another to my jaw. I felt everything. After they had their fun, I was forced to my feet. A chain was wrapped around my waist and secured with some kind of lock. They freed my hands from behind my back and kicked me in the arse, and I started walking. But I couldn't see anything, so I kept tripping, which made the men laugh. Then I felt a gentle tug on the chain. These men tethered me to the cow so I couldn't get away. I felt myself pass out from hunger, thirst, exhaustion. Then, from out of nowhere, I started feeling something smacking my face. I could hear people talking to me. Somehow, I managed to open my eyes and a very bright light in my face, and people standing all around me. They were police officers and EMTs. Turns out I had fallen asleep behind the wheel and driven my truck into an irrigation ditch on this side of the highway. I was told that a witness saw my truck do a somersault in the air as soon as my passenger side steer tire hit the ditch. The impact was so violent that my 5,500-pound trailer was uncoupled from the truck and flung 100 yards into the field like a toy, and the freight that was on it now covered almost 3 acres of real estate. As for me, I was ejected from the truck, despite the fact I was wearing my seatbelt, as the seat went with me, and landed 150 feet downrange from the initial impact, and walked away with nothing more than a broken jaw, a busted nose, sprung ankle, and 2 black eyes, which the doctors sewed shut for 24 hours to keep my eyelids from expanding so far from the swelling that my eyeballs would pop out. This was not only the worst experience of my career, but of my life. I did learn a valuable lesson from it, though. If I ever find myself fighting the urge to sleep again, I will be sure to pull my truck over and go to bed. Oh, and by the way, on one final note, I didn't realize it at the time, but the fat guy was me. And as for the cow, poor thing never knew what hit it. I can't explain the soldiers that were supposedly beating me, but I have my suspicions that they had something to do with the impact itself. Moral of the story: if you're tired, don't test fate. Pull over and go to bed. You'll be thankful for what you did when you wake up, and so will the animals that are in close proximity to your truck. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'm obliged to tell you that the last story, as fun as it was, is unfortunately the work of fiction. But nonetheless, I liked it and thought that you guys would probably enjoy it. I hope you aren't thinking now, oh, one of these wasn't true. Yeah, one of them wasn't true, but I thought it would be fun. I hope you liked it anyway. In any case, if you did, please be sure to let me know in the ways you know how. Also, if you could follow me on Twitter and Instagram, I'd really appreciate it, as I've got something big launching soon and it'd be good to keep you guys informed. I hope the video was up to scratch. In all honesty, I've got something funny going on with my nose and my throat. Pretty sure I have a cold. Don't worry, I don't have coronavirus. But yeah, if I sound funny, that's the reason. Sorry guys. Also, a huge thank you as always to my wonderful patrons, whose names are of course at the end of every video. It really does mean a lot. So thank you everyone for checking out the page. For a small amount every month, you can have some really cool perks, which are on screen. I mean, in the description. And yeah, just feel free to check them out. What's on screen are the names of the patrons, and you can be on there. Sorry guys, this cold is really getting to me. Alright, well for now I'm going to sign off. Stay healthy, stay awesome, stay away from coronavirus, and use the antiseptic gel on your hands. And I'll see you in the next one.